Welcome to the madness of rail in the United Kingdom. Before we begin, I want to make one thing clear. This will not be an episode about whether the rail system in the UK should be nationalised or privatised. I just want the system to work. I'll show that if you take intercity trains, you are being massively exploited, and we'll try to locate the money-swallowing black hole that lurks within UK rail. Then we can analyse statements like this.
There is more public subsidy going into a privatised railway system than ever went into a publicly run railway system.
This is Show Don't Tell, so let's show the numbers. Let's begin with this chart of passenger rail journeys. The chart shows just how much of an increase there has been since '97 when the railways were privatised. Now we won't get bogged down in who did what to who. All we have to agree on is that the line goes at a nice 45-degree angle up to the right. During this period, fares increased ahead or in line with inflation, which combines to show this. If we look at external passenger ticket revenue coming into the UK rail system, there is an additional £5.5 billion compared to pre-privatisation, an increase far ahead of inflation. Yet we still hear the trains are more subsidised than ever, so what is happening? To understand how this all fits together, we have this nice diagram from the Office of Rail Regulation, which shows how money flows through the whole UK rail industry. It starts with us passengers up at the top, paying £9.7 billion for tickets to the franchise train operators. These franchisees make a net payment of £0.7 billion to the government for the privilege of operating those franchises. Yes, overall they pay money to the government, not receive money from the government. The franchisees just operate services, they don't own any of the underlying infrastructure. Network Rail is the government-owned organisation that actually owns and maintains the tracks that trains run on, and it rents access to the tracks through track access charges. The regulator sets the price Network Rail can charge to franchise operators. In 2017, that was £1.5 billion. However, this doesn't cover Network Rail's costs. So it's the government who owns Network Rail, and they are on the hook to make up the difference with this extra £4.4 billion. We'll examine the franchised operations and Network Rail to expose where the madness lies. Rest assured, there is more than enough to go around. Let's start with the train operators. The £0.3 billion of surplus deficit inside the box is the overall profit of all 20 franchised operators. It's about 2.5% of the revenues, and frankly most transport companies make more profit running buses than running trains. Some train operations receive subsidies, some operations pay a premium. The why becomes clearer if we analyse services as three broad types: rural, suburban and intercity. Rural services offer cheap tickets per kilometre compared to suburban and intercity services. Rural services are far less popular than suburban and intercity services. If we multiply people per train by the rate per kilometre, we've calculated the average money a train makes for each kilometre of travel. The difference in this number between our three categories is huge. Rural services are cheaper to operate, but are nowhere close to breaking even from passenger income alone. In short, as rural services operate with staggering losses, they require hundreds of millions of pounds in subsidy to allow those services to run. Suburban services are a mix, but generally operate at a slight premium. Intercity services operate at a simply enormous profit, the vast majority of which is paid to the government. Although most of this money gets funneled into subsidising rural rail services, there are still more coming back to the government in premiums than paid out in subsidies, hence the £0.7 billion of net payment. Let's talk more about the East Coast Main Line. In 2017, East Coast Main Line paid £272 million to the government. That's a third of the entire revenue it received in the whole year. Let me just say this again. For every pound you spend on the East Coast Main Line, the government takes 33 pence. So if the government decided simply to forego its profit, the cost of rail travel would be 33% cheaper to consumers. Now, I don't have any objection to ensuring rural rail services are subsidised, but marking up the cost of intercity public transport by 33% as the means of doing this is simply ridiculous. The hidden economic and social costs of massive overcharging on public intercity rail travel must dwarf the £272 million they receive. All I ask is that the government relinquish these ever-increasing premiums because they have long passed the point of absurdity. If you travel between London and Edinburgh, instead of paying £140 return, you should only be paying £94, and the days of trains being more expensive than planes for intercity journeys can be over, because those days should never have existed in the first place. The only people to whom the system makes sense are the Department for Transport, because intercity rail travellers are their only possible source of income, but in any wider context, the current policy is pure, unadulterated madness. Let's move on to the next box of our diagram. The biggest cost to taxpayers is the £4.4 billion of support from the government to Network Rail. So let's understand why and address the question of whether this is a backdoor subsidy to the franchise train operators. Let's examine the same operators we had before. The best way I can show this is to do a comparison of costs between 2013 and 2017. First, let's compare the change in operator costs per train kilometre. Train operators' expenses increased at most by 15%, which is effectively inflation considering we're talking of a 4-year period. As there was no actual increase in train kilometres travelled in this period, I'd expect the same to be true of Network Rail. In 2013, Network Rail spent around £12 per train kilometre across all franchises. However, by 2017, the expenses are very, very different. Overall, Network Rail costs increased by 35% over this time period, far ahead of inflation, but this increase is very uneven in how it was distributed to the franchisees. On the intercity lines, they're 50 to 60% higher in just 4 years. Network Rail are champion bureaucrats, so they don't actually give expense breakdowns for individual franchises. They only give regional breakdowns which don't match any individual franchise at all. So the ORR, who compile these official numbers, use a strong disclaimer. Due to the overlapping and misaligned geographies of franchises and operating routes, there are many different approaches to the allocation of Network Rail's income and expenditure and the allocation of government funding to franchise train operators and operating routes. It is important that it is recognised that there is no definitive view on how this should be done, and therefore care is required in understanding and interpreting our analysis. These numbers are fundamental to answering the backdoor subsidy question I raised at the outset. For instance, West Coast Main Line is being allocated the entire spending increase in the London North West region in which it operates. And when expenses are greater than revenues, that's when the government has to step in with their network grant. If you allocate all the expenses to one line, it naturally follows that the network grant will be allocated there too, which creates a subsidy that you can then net off against any premium the operator paid. And in most cases, this means every franchise is at best neutral or usually slightly negative. I can only use intuition to question the expense allocations because these increases seem exceptionally high for intercity rail. But whichever way you look at it, the current system only exists to confuse the extent that intercity rail travellers subsidise the network and avoid stating this definitively in black and white. You may be asking the question, why doesn't Network Rail simply charge more money to the train operators and avoid these grants altogether? Well, that's not how the system works. Network Rail is regulated just like your water company is regulated, which means Network Rail has to sit down with the regulator and haggle over terms for a multi-year control period. A control period is when they agree in advance how much operations will improve over the period, how much they'll spend on new developments, etc, etc. The track access charge is then set to give a fair economic return to Network Rail, providing they achieve these targets. Network Rail need government grants because they are woefully failing in their control period targets. Network Rail agreed to deliver a 20% improvement in efficiency, whereas they're now expecting to deliver a 4% decrease in efficiency over the period. That's why the railways overall need lots of subsidy. Network Rail blows its budget and we have to pick up the costs. Ironies abound. People accuse franchises of overbidding, then complaining when they can't meet forecasts, but Network Rail has been doing this for years to the tune of billions of taxpayer pounds. It makes no difference if the train operators are privately or publicly owned. Network Rail is already owned by the government, and that's why the government foots the bill. In short, Network Rail is the black hole that consumes all the public subsidy that goes into the rail system. Now we've understood the issues and sins behind UK rail, we can understand the accusations against the rail system in more detail. Let's hear the full roll call from Jeremy himself.
I simply say this: when East Coast Main Line collapsed and was brought back into public ownership through direct rail, it ran well, paid £600 million into the Exchequer. We've now passed it over to Virgin East Coast, and are we getting £600 million back into the Exchequer? There you go. We have a system of train operating companies that are publicly owned, but unfortunately not by the British public, by the French, German or Dutch public, largely. And they are doing extremely well and extremely nicely, thank you. British Rail is always accused of being a basket case. In reality, British Rail was underfunded. There is more public subsidy going into a privatised railway system than ever went into a publicly run railway system. Bring it back into public ownership, and run it for the good of the public.
The first claim is that directly operated railways made £600 million for the taxpayer. Well, this number I found from articles written when talks began over refranchising directly operated railways. It says here they made £600 million. But these stories were from 2013, and Jeremy, you have missed a trick here, my friend. Take a look at the actual numbers for directly operated railways. The service wasn't refranchised until 2014. The numbers are correct. Between 2009 and 2012, there was £600 million of premium, but DOR ran for another 2 years after that. That's an extra £450 million. In total, over £1 billion. Let's not say there isn't something for everyone in this video. Use £1 billion next time. And you can also see the network grant allocation madness even in these numbers. And he does sort of shrug about Virgin, but yeah, they don't get to keep £250 million to themselves. They pay slightly more than DOR did to the taxpayer. Jeremy says that many of the train operating companies are foreign state-owned corporations. This is true. Many of these foreign state-owned corporations sell their services overseas. I would also FYI, you don't need to win a franchise to have public ownership. In January 2017, the Italian state rail company Trenitalia took over the C2C franchise by writing a £72 million cheque to National Express, slightly more money than National Express expected to make themselves. Something to think about, Jeremy. And are they doing extremely well and extremely nicely, thank you? Well, as I said earlier, most train operators make between 0 to 3% profit, a few £100 million between 20 franchises, so I wouldn't say extremely well. More subsidy in a privatised rail network. I'd say overall this is true. British Rail was subsidised by around £1 billion per annum. 20 years of inflation makes that closer to £2 billion in today's money, and we're certainly beyond that. However, that is entirely through Network Rail and has nothing to do with the privatisation of the rail network. In 2011, the McNulty report laid out a common sense vision for how many of these issues could be resolved, and it's been languishing on the shelf ever since it was written. So I imagine it'll take something pretty radical to stop Network Rail from soaking up billions and billions of pounds into the future. There's plenty of madness in UK rail, but I really hope the wisdom of reducing intercity travel costs will become more apparent to people. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode. This is Show Don't Tell, and I'll see you next time.